Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
And so long story short is, I think the number one thing I recommend to people in midlife is start the process of learning how you can be more curious again. Go to a museum or to a zoo or some place that isn't normal for you and just look at things like you're a 4-year-old.
Future Squared for episode number 283 with Chip Conley. Chip is a New York Times bestselling author and hospitality entrepreneur. He's a leader at the forefront of the sharing economy. At age 26, the founder of Joie de Vivre took an inner city motel and turned it into the second largest boutique hotel brand in the world. After being CEO of his innovative company for 24 years, Chip accepted an invitation from the founders of Airbnb to help transform their promising home sharing startup into the world's largest hospitality brand. In 4 years as head of global hospitality and strategy, he taught his award-winning methods to hundreds of thousands of Airbnb hosts and created the world-renowned Airbnb Open. Chip's books share his theories on transformation and meaning in business and life. In Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, which came out last month, he shares experiences from his tenure at Airbnb. Chip is also the founder of Fest 3000, San Francisco's annual celebrity pool toss that has raised millions for children and families, and the Hotel Hero Awards that shine a light on outstanding hospitality employees. He's the recipient of hospitality's highest honor, the Pioneer Award, and holds a BA and MBA from Stanford University and an honorary doctorate in psychology from Saybrook University. He serves on the boards of the Burning Man Project and the Esalen Institute, home of the Conley Library. Chip brought a wealth of modern elder wisdom with him into this conversation, so expect to learn lots, including 1, the critical importance of having a beginner's mind, 2, how Chip reinvented himself and joined a company whose product he had never used, where the average age was half his own, and where the way of doing things was not always what he was used to, and 3, how to separate from your self-imposed identity so that you can support personal reinvention in midlife, especially after you have invested decades into your skills, your career, and your brand. This is a must listen for anybody who is over the age of 35 or so. In fact, there's lessons in this for all ages because we are all living in a world that is constantly changing, and in order to survive, we must reinvent. With that, I bring you Chip Conley. Welcome to the show, Chip.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Steve.
So you're joining me all the way from sunny New York City, where you find yourself in the middle of your, in first week of your book tour.
I am, yes. It's exciting, and it's been a good week.
Yeah, I imagine it is. I imagine it's also a lot of adrenaline pumping through those veins this week, and a lot of anticipation in the build-up to this week as well.
That's true, and I'm doing a TED Talk at TED headquarters that's going to be simulcast to the whole TED community tomorrow. So that's going on as well. So yeah, I'm actually sleeping relatively well though, which is shocking.
Well, that's because you've got the wisdom of a modern elder, Chip. So if you were 25 years old, you'd probably be stressing and not getting much sleep.
Yeah, there is something you learn as you get older, which is in the course of my lifetime, how important is this? It's a question. It's an interesting thing to say to yourself when you're getting a bit upset about something when at the end of the day, it doesn't have a huge effect long term.
Yeah. And I think you definitely learn that with time. So the book is called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. And it argues that experience is effectively on the brink of a comeback. And you say, because at a time when power is shifting to younger people, companies are finally waking up to the value of the humility, emotional intelligence, and wisdom that comes with age. And I mean, we'll have an opportunity to unpack some of the concepts that you explore in your book throughout this conversation. But first, I really wanted to touch on an article that you penned recently, Chip, called "I Died 10 Years Ago and My Life Started Over," because I think there's so much value in that for our audience. So I'd love it if you could just fill our audience in on the events that led to what happened on August 19th.
Thank you. Yeah. I had, in the prior year, I had written my third book, which was called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. Mm-hmm. It became a bestseller. Now, let's just be clear. I'm not a writer. That's not my primary thing I do. I was a CEO of a boutique hotel company I'd started. And at that point, we had like 3,500 employees, and we were growing fast.
Yeah. And that was Joie de Vivre?
That was Joie de Vivre, exactly. And so I was in a place where I was starting to feel like I wanted to do something different. And then in 2008, we had the Great Recession, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I had a good friend of mine named Chip who committed suicide, which is a very awful experience, especially because we shared the same name and we were really quite close. Long story short is I broke my ankle playing baseball, got a bacterial infection in my leg, and next thing I knew, I was giving a speech on stage in St. Louis on crutches, and I went unconscious first, and then I went flatline, and meaning I lost a heartbeat, I lost any heart rate, and luckily that happened when the paramedics were already there, so they had to revive me and pull the paddles out and paddle my heart together started working again. And over the next 90 minutes, I ended up having that experience over and over again. My heart stopped. And so long story short is that was 10 years ago, when you have a flatline experience, it forces you to ask yourself, if you're going to die tomorrow, is this what you want to be doing today? And I realized after 22 years of being CEO of this company, I didn't want to be doing it anymore. And it led me over the next 2 years in the depth of the Great Recession to selling a company that I thought I'd have till I was 80 years old. And then I was fresh and ready to start something new. So that's really the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the back of that, you point out that in his new book, The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50, that Jonathan Rauch writes, younger people consistently and markedly overestimate how satisfied they'd be 5 years later, while older people underestimate future satisfaction. And that in between those two periods, during middle age, people experience a sort of double whammy where satisfaction with life was declining and expectations were declining with it, which is ultimately a recipe for misery, which led to, I suppose, what you experienced.
Our worst decade of our lives, Jonathan points this out in his book, and I do in mine as well, is our 40s. And that's pretty much across the planet. It's for some reason, it's that the 40s are a decade where we have the mixture of all of our hopes and dreams, and then some of them you can sort of see are not going to happen for you, or at least on the path you're on, you're going to have to make a major change if you want them to happen. And then you sort of you've accumulated so many responsibilities and things and, oh my gosh, kids and et cetera, that you get to a place in your 40s where you say, is this all there is? And for many people, they think it's never going to get better, because in many ways we sort of think of life after 50 as being just a slow decline, when in fact people actually get happier in their 50s than in their 40s, happier in their 60s than in their 50s, and happier in their 70s than in their 60s. The 70s are people's happiest decade. So long story short is I started to realize, I'm going to turn 58 next month. My 50s have definitely been my favorite decade. I'm sort of looking forward to my 60s. And that's a weird thing, Steve. I mean, like we don't usually think of aging as being aspirational.
No, we don't. I guess the pop culture doesn't really glorify aging.
No, it doesn't. And in many ways, there's an element, especially in the workplace, that people feel like, nobody wants me anymore. And I understand why. And that's really why I wrote the book, Wisdom at Work. was because there's a growing number of people in midlife and later who feel irrelevant.
Yeah. It's funny because I had to laugh because you said that for those of you my age, I mean, you're turning 58 this Halloween. Wouldn't you have appreciated a road marker around age 35 alerting you that this was one hell of a U-curve around the corner? And I literally turned 35 last week. So thank you, Chip.
Well, I feel badly for you. Like I've now made the next 15 years of your life just miserable. Here's the interesting thing. And you're a millennial. And I think what's really true is that part of the reason that people actually feel that sense of just bummed out in their 40s is because for many people, they had blinders on from college on. And, the thing that's beautiful about the millennial generation is that people have taken sort of a freestyle approach to how they live their lives, such that, they're not living based upon the 3-stage life of you learn till you're 25, you earn till you're 65, and then you retire till you die. A lot of people are choosing to take a sabbatical at age 28, or they're deciding to retire at 35, or if they can afford to. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to retire the rest of their life. That just means they're going to take a year or two off. They're going to take a sabbatical. Lots of people take a gap year after college or after graduate school. So I think part of the problem of the old school approach to how we've lived our lives with this 3-stage life is that people wake up in their 40s and say, the way I was told I was supposed to live my life isn't making me happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually wrote something about this recently where I kind of equated the fact that we have this expectation that life is linear and there's just this ongoing sort of upwards trajectory curve versus more of, say, a series of events where it's just like a bar chart, and kind of like what you've pointed out there, where younger people will just see life as a series of events. Hey, you may take a couple of years off here. You may take a sabbatical there, rather than just the 3-stage life that you're referring to.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with you.
So just on that point, I mean, you've introduced this notion in your book of a midlife atrium, which I guess for so long now, that whole 3-stage life has been about incremental improvement, incremental change, adding a thing here, tweaking a thing there as we get older. But what you're talking about is, as you get older, dramatic change.
Well, yeah, here's the point. I mean, the part that's fascinating is if you look back at the average longevity in the United States in the year 1900, it was 47 years old. And in the year 2000, it was 77. So we added 3 decades to the average person's life in a 1-century period. Mm-hmm. So in fact, the term midlife crisis was coined in 1965 because there was already at that point something clearly not working about midlife. And here we are 53 years later from 1965, and we haven't done anything to make the midlife crisis any better. In fact, what we've done is in some ways made the midlife crisis into a midlife marathon, because back then, midlife was 45 to 65. Now it's really 35 to 75 because people feel irrelevant earlier, especially in the technology world. And they're going to work past the normal retirement age, because if you're going to live till 100, you'll work till you're 75. So that all sounds terrible. But here's the part that actually shows a little bit of encouraging news. This idea of a midlife atrium was coined by a woman named Mary Catherine Bateson, whose mother was Margaret Mead, and the anthropologist. And what she said is that we're all going to live longer, but the way we've historically thought about that is almost like having a home, and you're going to add an extra bedroom on the back of the home, as if you're going to add an extra decade to your life in your 80s or 90s when you're already decrepit. And what she was able to show and really make a persuasive argument about is the idea that you get that extra atrium in the middle of your life. Because if we're staying healthy longer, it just means that maybe instead of actually sort of having your 50s be some period where decline starts, no, your 50s are your happiest decade up to that point, and you're healthy and you're relevant. And so you create an atrium in the middle of the home that provides air and light and a whole new perspective than creating a bedroom on the back of the house. And that's, I think, a really interesting and apt metaphor for those of us who are looking at midlife and saying, shit, excuse me, from here down, from here forward, the rest of my life's downhill. But when you think of it actually as an atrium, you start to imagine, wow, it just gets better healthier, fresher. I get more of a sense like I'm doing what I want to do in my life. And that's partly because as we accumulate in the first half of our life, the second half of our life, we tend to edit our lives and we focus on what's most important.
On that whole notion of the midlife atrium, I mean, by the time someone is 50, most people tend not to want to change and they've given up on conquering the world. Stability is preferred. You've perhaps invested a lot of time and energy into your skills, your career, your identity, your worldview. And a lot of people just don't want to start all over again. Yet with the world changing as fast as it is, that may not be a choice. So, I mean, how does one navigate having to start again in some cases? I mean, I know you're talking about the midlife atrium where you're just kind of changing something fundamental to allow more light in. But how does one embrace that when they may have their entire identity wrapped up in a particular career or profession?
Well, I've had the real good fortune of spending time with the first half of this year with 153 people who were in midlife who decided to be part of our beta test. We brought these people down to southern Baja, so Mexico, Baja California Sur, about 1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas. Beautiful place. We have a 3-acre beachfront campus there. And we've created something called the Modern Elder Academy. And this is a program where we have people coming for week-long and 2-week-long programs where we actually help them to imagine how their midlife could be different and how they can sort of mine their mastery to see how they want to live the rest of their life, and in essence, to repurpose themselves. And the number one thing that I noticed is that the hardest thing for people is to shift out of the identity of how they have historically been. So it's almost like they have a name tag that's adhered to their skin.
Yeah.
And almost, excuse the women who don't have chest hair, but you're a man with chest hair and you're trying to pull that name tag off, and it's really painful. And for many people, men and women, the idea of shifting your mindset and shifting your identity is hard. But it happens a lot in midlife. It happens when you're an empty nester and you have kids and they move on, and now you've got an empty nest. It happens when you have a divorce. It happens when you change a career or a job. It happens when you go through menopause for a woman, and actually men go through a lot of changes in their 50s as well in that way. So there's a lot of changes that happen, and we just need to get a little bit more honest about the fact that they're happening, and it helps people to start the process of evolving their identity and frankly, what they want to learn. The number one thing I recommend to people in midlife is get curious again. You spent a lot of your life with blinders on because you were just trying to make it through your life. But Peter Drucker is quite a famous management theorist who lived till age 95. And one of the things that people know about him is that every 2 years, he would take a new subject that was interesting to him but had nothing to do with being a management professor and author, and he would become one of the world's leading experts in it. Because what he liked about that, whether it was learning about medieval war strategies or Japanese ikebana, with little plants, he loved the fact that the process of getting curious about something was like a lubricant for his mind. It created a more curious spirit. And when curiosity is like a life-affirming elixir that creates a lot of resilience. And so long story short is, I think the number one thing I recommend to people in midlife is start the process of learning how you can be more curious again. Go to a museum or to a zoo or some place that isn't normal for you and just look at things like you're a 4-year-old and ask. The thing I did at Airbnb that made me popular there, but at first not so popular, was I asked a lot of why and what if questions. Most people, senior people in a company, and I was a very senior person at Airbnb, ask a lot of what and how questions because those are sort of optimization questions. But why and what if questions are like the questions a 4-year-old asks. But often a why or a what if question helps you to sort of see a blind spot that the organization might not have seen otherwise. So just, getting curious is very valuable.
And like you pointed out there, Chip, I mean, change is inevitable. It is the only constant, and we're going to go through these life changes anyway. And it's effectively about changing your relationship with change to something more positive rather than seeing it as, oh no, it's all downhill from here. It's about, well, what can I learn that is completely foreign to me, something that I'm actually interested in, that I can learn more about, that I can get curious about. And when you conflate that with, say, Dan Pink's book Drive on human motivation, he talks about mastery being one of the key intrinsic motivators. So learning something absolutely new about the world can reawaken that child within who's just curious about the world.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's something, someone said this to me recently, and it's like one of the top recruiters in the world. And she said to me, when someone's curious and engaged by life, I lose complete track of their age. And it was an interesting comment, because I think a lot of people as they get older feel like, oh God, I can't put my alma mater and what year I graduated on my LinkedIn profile because people will know my age. I understand, for somebody who gets concerned about that. But when you show up for an interview or when you actually meet people and you are in a curious and engaged place, people can feel that spirit. And it's really the spirit that really speaks to what people want to be surrounded by. They want wisdom. People love wisdom, but they also love youth. So, at Airbnb, I was surrounded by youth. But I was also this engaged, curious, wise person. And they liked me for that.
So you mentioned Airbnb, and you were invited to join the hospitality giant at the age of 52, which was a midlife atrium of sorts for you, Chip. What were your initial feelings or I guess hesitations when you were first invited by Joe, Brian, and Nathan to join the company?
The thing that was interesting, Steve, was that I didn't really know much about the company. Funny enough, I'd started my boutique hotel company, Joie de Vivre, in the very early era of boutique hotels in the mid-1980s. Mm-hmm. So I was a pioneer in my mid-20s. But by the time I got to 52, I was now the establishment. And I didn't really understand what Airbnb was. Like, why would anybody want to stay in someone's home when they could stay in hotels? So now I was the establishment. And I didn't really understand the business models too well. I really appreciated Brian because he was very curious. He had a growth mindset. Mm-hmm. But the thing that was most obvious to me in my first week is that I thought I was supposed to come into Airbnb and be the mentor to Brian and to sort of basically dispense my hospitality knowledge. But what became clear quickly was that I was in a technology company and I was 52 and I didn't know a damn thing about tech, nor did I understand the language they were speaking. And I realized quickly, like, wow, the only way I will survive here is if I'm as much an intern as I am a mentor. And that's really, to me, what defines the modern elder. The traditional elder of the past was regarded with reverence, and they dispensed wisdom. And when things didn't change very much from decade to decade, well, those wise old elders were valuable because it was sort of timeless wisdom. But in an era like we're in right now, where things are changing so much, the person who is not relevant and as a wise elder is not all that valuable. And so while the traditional elder was held in reverence, the modern elder is all about relevance. And relevance means that you better be as curious about learning about things as you are being the wise person dispensing the wisdom. Yeah. So that was my big lesson, is like, wow, I better become, the dumbest person in the room, asking lots of questions and really being willing to have a beginner's mind from a technology perspective. And luckily, it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, and you've been quite explicit as well in your book about differentiating between elder and elderly.
Yes. Yeah. Elderly, when I first started talking about being a modern elder, people looked at me like, really? You want to be elderly? And I said, I don't really want to be elderly. And elderly's fine. I mean, it is a stage of life, but typically elderly is a stage of life when you're a bit in a dependent position. In fact, interesting statistic is that the average age of someone going into a nursing home today is in their early to mid 80s. And actually just 50 years ago, that number was 65. So, we've almost added 20 years to when a person is still vibrant and not necessarily dependent. And that's a person who I think is in sort of their modern elder phase, whereas elderly is maybe the last 10 or 15 years of your life. So long story short is, yes, I've tried to embrace, this is not the first time though, black used to be a word that you would not call someone in the South. Black people did not call each other black because, frankly, it was the rednecks in the South who called people black, and black was a derogatory term until Malcolm X and a few people in the Black is Beautiful movement in the 60s actually reclaimed the word. So I'm sort of in the mindset of reclaiming the word elder.
You mentioned that when you joined the company, Chip, I mean, you really didn't get Airbnb, didn't understand why someone would stay in a stranger's house. You didn't write code. You didn't use Uber or Lyft. You were twice the age of the average Airbnb employee. I mean, one of these factors would turn a lot of 52-year-olds off from joining the company, let alone all of them. They make for ample, I guess, excuse-making fodder for not taking the role. How important was it that you went into it with that beginner's mind? And I guess you just had a predisposition towards embracing the unknown versus making excuses as to why you shouldn't take the role.
Steve, it was a combination of things. But let's start by saying I was in a lucky position because of the fact that I was asked to join.
Yeah.
So it's a very different situation if you're trying to get a job and no one's returning your calls. But so I had that positive going for me. But a negative I had going against me was I'd spent the last 24 years being the CEO of a company I'd started. So the idea that I had to right-size my ego from being like the what I call the sage on the stage to actually being the guide on the side, meaning I was no longer the person who sort of was the face of the company. I was the coach on the side, helping these three young founders who started their company at the same age when I started mine, helping them to be successful. And it really required me to sort of say, okay, it's not all about me. And that was, that took some ego right sizing. Not a bad thing, frankly. And then also, I think just being scared, one of the things that's interesting is if you've been successful, you're worried sometimes about having a failure. Liz Gilbert talks about this, the author. She wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love, and it became an overnight success. And she said it was really hard to write her next book because people sort of look at it and say, is she going to be able to repeat that success? And really rare that a sequel of anything is going to be as successful. So here I was, the guy who had created a successful company, sold it. I did sell it at the bottom of the recession, so it wasn't the best timing. But there was a part of me that was worried that, wow, am I sort of going backwards here? I'm no longer running the company. And this company seems like it's sort of a company that might not do all that well because I don't understand the business model. And I feel stupid here. I'm not in charge. And they're talking a language I don't know. So there was a lot of things I had to look at. But I once asked, early on in my time there, I asked my father what I should do. And my dad said a really interesting thing. He said, how can you turn your fear into curiosity? And this is what I was saying earlier. Curiosity is such an interesting way of looking at life that when you actually get curious, you sort of move out of the place of fear and into the place of possibility. And that's what I did.
Yeah. And that ties in perfectly with what my next question was going to be, just around a lot of your more established, say, industry executives who grew up on, say, 20th century management philosophy. It served them well. They reached the upper echelons of large organizations, but now they struggle with new notions such as experimentation and getting out of the building from day one and failing fast and all these sort of slogans that are quite prominent in Silicon Valley, and completely opposed to the voracious planning that got them to where they are today. I mean, I imagine you would have encountered a little bit of dissonance yourself with the way things were done at Airbnb and the way you did things at Joie de Vivre.
There's no doubt. I was in a bricks and mortar business. I was not in a technology business. And everything from how quickly we were renting more office space and hiring staff, I thought we were like, this is crazy. We're doubling in size in terms of staff every year. Yes, our revenues were doubling in size, but we shouldn't be doubling staff at the same time. But you know what? I was way underestimating what our needs were going to be. And so, yes, this is the part that's beautiful. To actually be a learner, a lifelong learner, and to learn a whole new way of thinking in midlife is really valuable. At the same time, there were times where I had to hold true to what I believed was real. often when it came to emotional intelligence or just leadership skills. At the end of the day, we talk about B2B businesses and B2C and C2C and A to Z, but all business is fundamentally H to H, human to human. So some of the qualities that I think don't change a whole lot is the qualities of understanding how do you create an engaged employee base? How do you create a culture that actually helps people see both a meaning in work and a meaning at work? The difference being a meaning at work is the purpose of the company. The meaning in work is the work you're doing on a daily basis. How is that impacting it? Those are things that are timeless, no matter what kind of industry or company you're in or what era you're in. The facts of how fast we grow, how we go global, some of that, can change a lot. But I will say I was really proud that about 3 or 4 weeks into my time at Airbnb, I was originally just head of global hospitality. Brian said to me, I really like the way you think. Will you become the head of strategy as well? So all of a sudden I became the head of global hospitality and strategy. And he said, it's, your pair of glasses you wear are not coming from the technology world. And that's really helpful. So he liked my strategic thinking, even though I didn't have any kind of, I never worked for McKinsey or Bain or Booz Allen or anybody like that. I'd been an entrepreneur. And so he really liked that. So I think that that's the part that's interesting. If power is escalating to the young faster than ever before, and there's a growing number of people who are older and going to stay in the workplace longer, why don't we pair them up? If we did that, if Travis at Uber had a modern elder by his side, 15 or 20 years older than him, he still might have his job.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. And you talk about that in your book, whereby, power's cascading to the young faster than ever before. But many of these young digital leaders are expected to miraculously embody the relationship wisdoms that elders have had decades to learn.
That's right. It's, I have a lot of empathy for these young leaders, for Brian Chesky, who I was mentoring, but he was mentoring me as well. Imagine starting a company and it's a disruptor and, there are no laws or rules about what you're doing. And so you're having to sort of build the business while you're trying to change laws at the same time. And you're doing it in 191 countries within 4 or 5 years of starting. And you've never run a business before. I mean, it's nuts. But, some of these young leaders, Mark Zuckerberg and, the Google founders, they've been able to stay in their seat. Now, many of them are struggling right now, Elon Musk, et cetera. But let's take our hat off to them that this would be a hard job if you'd had 50 years of business experience. And so I think they're growing fast. The key for them is to have as much humility as they have hubris. This is the number one thing I would just say to young people, especially if you're young and very successful in your 20s. You may think that you have the golden touch because that business you created immediately took off. And the number one thing that a young person needs to learn is failure relatively early on, to realize that they're not always right. And I think that process of moving from hubris to humility is what really happens between our 20s and about age 50. And that it's another reason why I think creating an age-diverse workplace and a senior leadership team full of people of various generations is quite helpful. Because if you're always about hubris, the truth is you actually become a bit of an enemy to a lot of people over time who just are tired of your ego, not just as an individual, but even the culture of the company. I think Uber was unfortunately an example of that.
On Uber, you mentioned Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Obviously, Twitter and Facebook have both been in Congress recently. And that youthful naivety, that hubris can help a company go a very long way. And, many say people in their 40s or 50s, when confronting the regulatory realities that Airbnb confronted, that Uber confronted, they might have just said, oh, well, this is too hard. We can't do this because of this regulation, because of that legislation. Let's just not do it. Whereas that youthful naivety just forces you to push forward and find a way up until a point. But now we're obviously seeing some of the pushback against big tech in Congress. And you've got writers such as Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote Homo Deus and Sapiens, saying that in today's environment, it's not about the land, it's not about the machines, it's about data. And data is absolutely everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But it's a new form of power that we're dealing with. And he basically says we better call upon our lawyers, our politicians, our philosophers, and even our poets to turn their attention to this conundrum, because you may be great at building a tech company, but there are so many other things to consider when it comes to how to best apply this technology in the world without unsettling, say, some philosophical questions, some economic questions, some political questions. And I guess that's kind of what we're seeing now with Musk and Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and so on.
I mean, I think the ethics go back to, old Greek and Roman times. And I think ethics are a really interesting conversation starter in Silicon Valley today. Is what are the ethics of the attention economy? If really what Facebook and the others, the social media platforms, are predominantly doing is trying to just divert our attention all the time. I mean, it's really like a slot machine. It's like being gambling in Vegas or Atlantic City or something like that, where you can't find your way out of the casino. So I think there's an element of ethics that these companies really need to ask themselves. I know that at Airbnb, one of the things we had to ask ourselves is, are we contributing to affordable housing crises in certain cities? We knew that in many cases, we were a positive for affordable housing because there were people, especially older people who were empty nesters, who were using Airbnb as a host to actually help pay their rent or their mortgage because they had an extra 1 or 2 or 3 bedrooms that their kids had moved out. At the same time, if you have commercial speculators taking over residential homes or apartments and then turning them into nightly rentals, there's a risk with supply and demand. So we've had to look at these things, and they're difficult questions. But I think the companies that actually start to figure these things out early, are able to adapt their business model early enough so they don't get addicted to the crack. And addicted to the crack is, frankly, addicted to whatever it takes to drive, your revenues and your net income. And when companies do that, ethics sometimes take, a back seat.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole notion of having a social license to operate is nothing new. I mean, I remember reading about this back in the mid-90s when I was just starting high school. And back then it was more so around social responsibility and ensuring that you don't pollute and then ensuring that you pay fair wages and so on. And I think now the tech world's starting to fall into place as far as that's concerned, because for so long it's gone unchecked, but now people are finally starting to ask questions. And what you said there about the attention economy, I think Mark Benioff of Salesforce came out and said something along the lines of Facebook should be regulated like cigarettes. And just this morning, before this conversation, I mean, it's 8 a.m. now in Australia, well, in Melbourne, Australia, but this morning I was in the gym and literally half the people I saw in the gym, rather than working out, they were just heads down at their phones more than half the time they were there. And the implications of that, especially when you look at human beings and our tendency to do our best work when we are completely focused and in the zone, can be quite devastating as far as creativity is concerned.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think, I think one of the things that we're learning is that as you move from one era to another, there's a new set of regulations that need to come in place. And we have to be careful about, over-regulating.
Yes.
There's the over-regulation. Regulation can put a big crimp on innovation. Mm-hmm. So, but let's recognize that when we went from the agricultural era to the industrial era, there needed to be some regulation because you had child labor and you had like billowing smoke coming out of factories right in the middle of town and all kinds of awful things. You had people working too many hours. And so the idea that regulation was necessary, looking back on it, hindsight says, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll do the same when it comes to technology. Technology should be a tool. It should be a way for people to actually have a better life and to actually create productivity and efficiency in ways that actually serve people well. But when it's really being used more as a means for us to sort of monopolize people's time, we really, I think the idea of time being valuable is something that we really appreciate the older we get. And I think it's definitely one thing that someone who's a little older can speak to, because the less time you have in your life, the more valuable it is. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, we have not thought about time as being a commodity. And I think when we have, in the technology era, things that were supposed to be efficiency creators, so we got time back. And then we have Facebook, which takes another 45 minutes of our day each day. Like, where's that coming from? Where's the 45 minutes coming from that I used to have that I don't have because I'm on Facebook? Mm. And that's a really important question to ask.
Yeah. And I mean, just on that point, Tim Urban has a fantastic post or blog post called The Tail End, in which he's basically mapped out, basically in a grid with about 100 circles on that grid, how much time you have left to spend with your parents, for example. Chances are you lived at home up until you're maybe 18. You may see them once a week, once a month, depending on whether or not you live in the same part of town. And therefore, you've pretty much spent 99% of the time that you're going to spend with your parents. And if you've only got 1% left, you should savor that time rather than look at your phone half the time you're at dinner with your folks.
Can't argue with that, Steve. I think it's a great point.
I mean, the regulation point, I think I couldn't agree more with that. And it's something that Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired Magazine, I had him on the show last year. And he was saying that kind of echoed what you said, that you can't regulate the technology too early, because if you regulated the internet, say back in 1993, well, then perhaps we wouldn't have half or even a quarter of the game-changing technologies and applications that we have today. And that the regulation should be all about creating value for customers rather than, say, protecting entrenched interests of incumbents.
Yeah, Kevin is one of the sharpest people I know on the planet. Weirdly, wherever we seem to always be on the same lecture circuit because we end up speaking at the same conferences. So, a big fan of his.
Massive fan of his. So one other thing I wanted to touch on, Chip, was this whole, you joined Airbnb, the average age was pretty much half your age. Did you ever feel, or did you get the impression that certain people, and obviously it's a bit delicate, but that people that people may not have respected you or taken you seriously because you were twice as old as them?
I would say that when it was an issue, that there maybe 3 times when that was an issue. If I didn't understand when they were talking about something in tech language, tech lingo, I learned over time that I could save my questions around, like if someone's using a language, like, early on someone said, if you shipped a feature and nobody used it, didn't really ship. I didn't know what that meant on day 3. By day 10, I probably did. So there's a lot of things I could just make a note of and ask one-on-one to somebody. So if I showed myself as pretty much of an idiot on that, that was not a good idea. But again, when I asked bigger questions, like a bigger question would be, well, we use a peer-to-peer review system, but how do we make sure there's not retribution? I mean, Airbnb's peer-to-peer review system is sort of based upon what happens on Yelp and TripAdvisor and things like that. But we're actually, it's a 2-sided system. So a host and guests review each other. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if you're giving a bad review as a guest to a host, you could get retribution. The host could write. So no one had ever asked that question. We knew it was happening. We saw a spike up on day 30 because that was the last day you could actually put a review up. And so sometimes people waited until the last day to put the review up because they didn't want to have retribution from the host if it was a guest. So asking the question about why, it was like, oh, okay. So I think the key was to make sure that, like, the simple questions about just my lack of tech lingo, I didn't necessarily have to talk about publicly. But some of the bigger questions, like where I was coming across as like, hey, he's an older guy asking sort of a really weird but really profound question, that got people saying, Chip asks a lot of questions that people almost take for granted. And that's where it got better. And yes, here, what was also nice was that I there's something called Burning Man, the big arts festival. I'm on the board of Burning Man. And so I had some, I guess, street cred because of the fact that I know how to hang out with people in the desert and who are a lot younger than me there. So I think the number one thing, here's the number one thing I would just say for someone who's older. The number one thing you can do is to listen. Recently I was at the Summit Series giving a talk to them in Utah, and there was an owl that they had, right outside before I gave my talk on wisdom. Here's this owl they had outside, and I said to the guy who was tending to the owl, I said, so why are owls considered wise? And he said, the owls are wise, perceived as wise, because they have the best hearing of any animal in the forest. So what does that say? It suggests that owls are considered wise because they listen well. And so one of the things that I think we need to think about as we're in midlife and beyond is how are we a better listener? And listening not just to the story, but for the story. Because when I think I've been at my best with a younger person is when they're telling me something, but I'm actually, and I'm capturing the specifics, but I'm seeing there's an underlying theme that this person's not seeing. And then I can, in a proper and respectful way, point that out. And at the end of the day, that kind of candid wisdom is what people really appreciated.
Yeah. So I guess it's about differentiating between just asking all the questions and asking the smart questions. Because if you ask all the questions, say, what does ship it mean? Then people may start to disrespect you by saying, well, this guy doesn't get anything. I mean, in today's age, you can just make notes. You can Google that later. But when it is something a little bit more profound that you think is actually not being considered, then you ask those types of questions.
Exactly. Yes.
So you serve on the board of the Burning Man project. I'd love to learn a little bit more about how your relationship with the festival came about, Chip.
Well, I had been going for many years. A lot of my friends who were sort of in the creative industries in San Francisco had been going, and I was impressed by, wow, it was sort of like a utopian society out there in the desert. As Brian Chesky from Airbnb once said, he said, this is what the world would be like if artists ruled the world. And I started giving talks about a variety of things, and I used Burning Man as sort of a model of a new kind of organization that is less hierarchical, and it's more the community does a lot of the organizing for Burning Man. And then the founders were going to take what was a for-profit company and turn it into a nonprofit, and they approached me and said, "Listen, we've heard you say lots of good things about us." And you've done some fundraisers for us, and we'd love to have you help us turn into a nonprofit. And so that's what I did starting about 8 years ago. And it's been quite an experience because it's a global community, and the people are very passionate about Burning Man. Those who go and those who some go have heard about it. And it has lots of wild myths around it. You do not have to be taking drugs there. You do not have to be naked. It is not only sex and drugs and and craziness. There's actually, of the 70,000 people who go, about 7,000 of them are part of the family camp. There are families with kids 2, 3, 5, 10 years old. They're experiencing this utopian art experience.
Yeah, well, it's still on my bucket list, so I hope to make it over there next year, Chip. So I've heard many a good thing from all sorts of people, so I can't wait to check that out. One final question before we jump into our lightning round, Chip, is something that, again, Yuval Noah Harari pointed out in his recent book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, where he basically says that if he has just one piece of advice for today's 15-year-olds, it's not to rely on the adults too much. Most of them mean well, but they just don't understand the world. How do you respond to this?
Well, I also think he says in the book, and in many of it, a Medium article he just wrote about this, that the world today is about reinvention. And he says, if you're a 15-year-old, the thing you need to learn more than anything else is reinvention.
Yes.
So I would agree with him that if the kinds of people he knows who are in midlife have not learned to reinvent themselves and are living from a playbook of 20 years ago, completely agree.
Yep.
I think what he may be neglecting and what he said is the idea that there's a growing number of people in midlife who are realizing they have to reinvent themselves.
Again, that echoes what Kevin Kelly said, which was the number one thing kids need to learn today is learning how to learn, because the next 50 years of their lives will be characterized by that ongoing change and reinvention. And even recently, I spoke with Jeffrey Gitoma, who is part of the Napoleon Hill Foundation, and he's just published a book about the first writings of Napoleon Hill. And I asked him this question about singular focus, because Napoleon Hill was all about just having that singular focus. And I said, well, how can you have singular focus in a world that's constantly changing? Because the rug may be pulled out from underneath you. He said, well, you've got to have 5-year windows. Focus on the 5 years and then be open to changing. And so if you have many 5-year windows in your life, it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier around, millennials' approach to the world today is not necessarily linear. It's about having these sort of series of events throughout their lives. And that 5-year window and that constant reinvention ties into that quite well.
Completely agree.
Thank you so much for your time, Chip. I think you've left particularly our elder listeners with a lot of words of wisdom. But before we wrap up, I'd love to throw you into our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll? Let's do this.
Yeah.
Question number 1, Chip, is if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
I probably want to work for Elon Musk in any of his ventures, only because I do feel I'm not a complete fanboy in the sense of everything he does. He's walking on water. But I really appreciate the audacity he has in some of the things he's imagining. He's imagining things that just make me want to be by his side in a meeting at a whiteboard.
What are your views on the public sort of response to his Joe Rogan interview? Because I think he said so many profound things, and he touched on augmented humanity and all manner of things. And the one thing that everybody honed in on was this one puff of a legal marijuana joint.
Yeah, I think it's sad, and it's sort of the way things are, is that people love intrigue, and that was the intrigue. So just know that he's a brilliant guy, and I think watching where he goes in the future, knowing that he's in his mid-40s, he's got 40 more years of some major pioneering ahead of him.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see how that plays out. Question number 2, Chip, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would ask Leonardo da Vinci how he was so talented in so many ways. And I'd ask that same question to a variety of other people who just, how did they have talent in the way that we call them Renaissance men or Renaissance people? Whereas today we have a tendency to be quite narrow in our focus of what it is we might be world class at.
Yeah, no, absolutely love that. And also asking, like you said, that question of influential people and understanding who they would ask the question of, like, where do they get their inspiration from, I think is quite powerful. And lucky last, Chip, you're in your 50s now and you're still kicking goals. You're on the TED stage tomorrow night. I mean, what do you do on a daily basis to stay on top of your game?
I've been meditating for 30 years. And I have to say that when I've been either stressed out or I've been riding the wave of lots of momentum, the idea of meditating, whether it's, and I've done lots of different styles of meditation, but I try to do about 20 minutes a day. That has helped to, in essence, try to moderate both the highs and the lows. And it's helped, frankly, for me to feel like at the end of the day, all of that crazy stuff happening out there in the world doesn't have to affect that 20 minutes of profound tranquility that I can have when I meditate.
Yeah. And do you do a transcendental meditation or any particular type?
Yeah, the type that I do now is I try to do 20 minutes in the morning of TM and then 20 minutes late in the day if I can. But I've also done a variety of other methods. And I think doing a Vipassana silent meditation retreat for a week is, one of those cathartic experiences that almost is like pressing a reset button on your energy center. And so I would recommend that as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chip, for giving up an hour to spend with me and to share your wisdom with listeners of Future Squared. Listeners can pick up a copy of the book on Amazon. It came out yesterday. I'll share that in the show notes. They can hit you up on Twitter at Chip Conley and visit chipconley.com. Is there anything else I should be sharing with our audience, Chip?
I think the only thing I would say is on LinkedIn, I write a lot of articles. One of the articles you mentioned today, Steve, is one that I put on LinkedIn, and weirdly enough, I had over 100,000 views in about 3 days, and I don't have a huge LinkedIn following because I've just recently sort of come back to LinkedIn. So I go look at the articles on LinkedIn if you want to know what's on my mind.
Great. We'll add that into the show notes as well. Thank you so much again, Chip, and good luck with your TED Talk tomorrow.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Cheers. Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glibeski and on Instagram at TheSteveGlibeski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.